it's very presumptive and ignorant to make decisions based on things never really changing for the worse. Does that make any sense?
Hi, I'm Dre.
Hi, I'm Leia.
And I'm Jason, and this is the Post-Normal Show.
All right, how are you two doing this week?
Not bad. I cleared my entire to-do list for the first time, I feel like, in many years. We'll see if it's actually the first time in many years. I have no idea, but it feels like for the first time in many years, I cleared off every single thing that I owe to anybody else and any major sort of assigned thing that I have on my plate.
That's great. That's a great feeling.
It's a weird feeling. I don't know if it's a great feeling. It's just like, it's that sense like something's missing. I have a little bit of anxiety around it. Like I'm supposed to be doing something and I'm not doing that thing. It's weird. It's a weird feeling.
You should just add a to-do item to your list, which is to just do more stuff. Just add that, and you'll be fine.
That's just too ambiguous. I need
ambiguous.
something more concrete. Yeah, I have to start thinking about what my next steps are, depending on how long this thing is going to go. So I've got to figure out my life going forward.
There you go. Don't we all?
Yes.
Jason, how's your life been going this week?
This week was the hardest week. I don't know why. I think I convinced myself that I was fine and I was doing fine and I was working hard and getting a lot of stuff done. And I hit a wall. I hit a wall this week.
What kind of a wall? Like an emotional wall, a physical wall? Like what?
It wasn't a physical wall. I'll tell you that. It was. It was just. I don't know what happened. I was getting small little triggers, if that's the right word, throughout the week where a small little thing would happen and then I'd suddenly feel like it wasn't quite a panic attack, but it was kind of like when you breathe a bit differently and you feel like you're going to cry and you feel like you can't quite understand this rush of emotions that are coming on. I just really couldn't control my emotions and it felt really strange. I'm used to I've worked really, really hard throughout my life on gaining control of how I feel and the reactions that I have to things, and I guess I reached my limit and felt overwhelmed this week for the first time since this all COVID-19 thing started.
Oh, that sucks. That sounds like the slow marching dirge of anxiety.
Probably.
Just stomping away in the background.
But I feel a lot better today. I think one of the I'll get to this in a bit, but I watched this crazy show on Netflix, and it was sort of like a podcast. There was a moment in this interview, in this exchange between a mother and son, where the mother was telling the son about what life was like, and he asked her, "What do you do when things get really hard and your heart is hurting?" And she said, "You just cry." And then I was like, ugh, and I started crying. I was like, oh my God, what? But it's true. I think that we have this natural release valve, and that it's actually really important sometimes to let your emotions run their course. And when they do, man, I feel so much better today than I did in the middle of the week, just because I let myself feel all the emotions that I was trying to control.
Well, you got to empty the glass before you can fill it back up again, right?
Yeah, and let yourself actually react to what is going on as opposed to trying to manipulate it. That's my thought perspective on it.
I wonder if we're all having these moments at like different times, because I had that moment like fairly early on, like because I went in and researched everything around this sort of crisis that we're having. So I had my breakdown early, and then I felt better after that. And I sort of recovered, and I've managed to stay there now.
That's good. I feel a lot more stable and a lot happier, I think. Which is why I feel more hyperactive today and more talkative.
That's good. I wasn't programmed with that, an emotion thing. I think they forgot to put that in me.
Aw.
Well, I'm sorry you had a freak out, but I'm glad to hear that you overcame it and you're feeling better today. Same with you, Leia. I'm glad I think you're feeling better. No, you're anxious because you don't have any things on your to-do list. So I can't console you for that.
That's a different thing. That's a me issue, not a world issue.
Yeah. I don't know. I'd say that a you issue is a world issue. I mean, technically speaking, and if you want to get metaphysical, the world only exists because you perceive it. So I think all personal issues are just global issues.
I guess in some way.
I was reading a bunch of metaphysical stuff earlier this week. This is a book that's positing that space-time theory is doomed and is at odds with evolutionary theory and evolutionary chaos theory. He has this entire thing around consciousness that he's imagining, and there's some really interesting metaphysical ideas around that, but when you look at the underlying science behind it, it's kind of mumbo jumbo, but at the same time, it's an entertaining read because it puts your brain in interesting places. But it is a little bit flaky. So yeah, my brain's been thinking about that as good fodder for storytelling. And speaking of the stories that we're going to tell today on our podcast, I believe we're going to be talking about decisions, aren't we?
Well, first, I think I find it very interesting that I did not decide to break down this week. I feel like there are a lot of things that just happen to us, and that links to a whole slew of thoughts, some related to science fiction and some of the shows that some of us have been watching around Westworld and devs and the idea that we make choices? Is everything predestined? Are decisions actually real, or are they just an end result of a bunch of complex things that have been put in place since the Big Bang? Do we actually have free will? Those are some really interesting thoughts, and I don't want to go into a lot of those in detail, but the one thing that I wanted to bring up is a book that I read a little while ago called Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned. And the title is terrible because I can never remember this book, so that's why I wrote it down. But the subtitle is actually what the book is about, and the subtitle is The Myth of the Objective. So the idea that we have plans, that we decide that we're going to get better and better at something, or that we're going to buy a house, or we're going to, I don't know, write a novel, and we set all these things in motion. The thing I like about this book, Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, The Myth of the Objective, is that it sort of destroys that idea. And these guys that wrote the book are some of the forefathers or foremost thinkers of AI, and how to use AI in the true sense of the form, which is to figure out problems. Really, instead of setting an objective, what you should do or could do, or what AI does, is it looks at the next steps, and you take the best possible next step to find something interesting. And if I look back at my own life, I look back at the decisions that I've made, and some things are really lucky or feel really lucky, and some things feel really terrible or difficult. it is a series of taking what I believed were the next best steps. I didn't plan ever to be a consultant in a financial company. I didn't ever plan actually to become a creative director in an ad agency. I never planned a lot of these things. They just were the result of various steps that I made throughout my life that seemed like the most interesting thing that I could do at the time. And because I just followed that flow, that's where I ended up today. And what they posit in the book is that is the way that AI works. So just throwing it out there, something to think about.
I like that. There's something a little less daunting about taking the next step versus making a big decision, especially when we're talking about like the big life decisions. So I've been thinking about decision making a lot because of the decision fatigue that we're all feeling right now. The fact that, you know, every little tiny thing that we do now requires conscious thought. So I think we've talked about that a little bit before. But I find myself in a weird sort of crossroads where there's the decision fatigue happening from all of the little stuff, but I now have to start thinking about the bigger stuff as well. Then the next big steps of in terms of like, how am I going to pursue my career next? What's going to play out there? What do I do? What decisions do I make? So all of that is sort of happening at once. And then, you know, you're kind of rationing out your energy between these little things and these bigger things and trying to find some sort of balance of, okay, I'm just going to get through the day and I'm going to figure out what's going to come, you know, around the corner as well. So I like the idea of doing the next steps because over a long period of time, like if I look back at my decisions, there are decisions that I've made that seem like bad decisions right now that could end up being good decisions later, and decisions that I made that I thought were good decisions that I'm, you know, kind of questioning whether or not they were the right things to do. And so I wonder if there's no such thing as a good decision. Over time, there are just things that you do.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to look at it. I do believe that, you know, the best decision is the most immediate decision. You know, to decide to do something long term, I think it's important. I think it's important to have that goal. I think it's also really important to know that the goal is just it's a North Star that you're aiming towards, but you never know which way the winds will blow you in the long road, in the long journey, because you know, if you're taking a really long journey, a really subtle shift by 1 degree will land you several hundred kilometers in a different place. And I think same goes with these things. But yeah, the earliest decision, the most immediate decisions are typically the most important decisions. But my take on a lot of this too is I make decisions about decisions. Like I decide what kind of decision I need to make. So I have this entire codified list of styles of decisions that I have. And first, when I decide what this kind of decision needs to be made, then I can make the decision based on the filter that I've applied.
Okay, so I need some clarification on that. So what do you mean by immediate decision?
The immediate things are typically the most pressing things, right? The immediate things are the most tangible objects. Like think about the Eisenhower Matrix for productivity, right? There's 4 quadrants. There's important and urgent. There's not important and urgent. There's not urgent, important, and not urgent, not important. So those are the four parts of the matrix. Urgent is important. So you need to make sure that you're taking care of these immediate things, because when a decision doesn't get made and it slips by because you're too busy pondering a future decision, that's when ball's been dropped, when you have possibly disappointed someone in the process or accrued interest on your credit card. So the immediate decisions are the ones that have the most immediate impact on our lives. The longer term decisions can wait, but that's not to say that you should forego long-term decisions. You need to be thinking about that. But then you have to classify your decisions. Like, what kind of decision are you making? So the Eisenhower Matrix is one way that I prioritize the things that I do so I can decide, should I do this or should I offload this? That's a very easy way to get more productivity. But then I also have other decisions that are like, I have the list right in front of me. There are calculated decisions, careful decisions, chaotic decisions, collected decisions, consensus decisions. I have about 12 or 13 different alliterative decisions that I've classified.
How did you accumulate these different items?
I just thought of all of the decisions that I tend to make. And I think of the reasons why I make these decisions. And I read a lot of philosophy. I like Alain de Botton in the School of Life. I think he touches on a lot of these types of things. But I started codifying decision makings when I was working on my card set, the strategic science fiction card set. And one of the characteristics that I wanted to apply to characters was I want them to have a characteristic of decision making. And then I probably spent 2 hours blowing out a list.
So how do you decide
what kind of a decision is a job offer? Well, to a certain degree, I would say that it is it's a careful decision. So a careful is when you use your experience and your intuition to help you decide, because ultimately your life is just a culmination of every decision you've ever made. So that's what your gut instinct is, and that is the careful decision. So when you think about careful, that would be one filter that you could apply that. I would also say calculated decision is another one. The calculated decision is when you think more like a data scientist, when you're using the data and the information that you have available to make a very calculated assessment of the situation. So I would say probably a cross between careful and calculated is where you would need to go. You wouldn't want to do a chaotic decision. You wouldn't want to flip a coin to decide, which job to take. But depending on your attitude, maybe it is. Maybe you've got two offers and you don't know which one to choose. So maybe
I could become an accountant or an assassin.
Isn't there a movie of an accountant that is an assassin? Isn't that a Ben Stiller movie?
I think it's called The Accountant. Yeah,
Oh.
I think it's, yeah.
Here's the issue I have with that. So you can codify different types of decisions, but that doesn't guarantee you're making a good decision. And sometimes, the things that work out really well for you are not decisions that you've actively made or spent time on. Like I've taken job offers and applied for things on a whim that have worked out. And then I've made really careful, calculated moves over periods of time that then blow up in my face later. So I don't know if codifying a type of decision would then help you make better decisions. I do think it can help you like maybe sort out in the moment, like what you're trying to do in terms of how to approach the problem, but does it necessarily lead to better outcomes?
I'm not talking about better outcomes. I'm talking about quicker decisions. And I think a quicker decision is a better decision in situations like this, because if you flounder too long on any given decision, then you risk it not doing well. But yeah, there's never a guarantee for any decision that you make.
You might miss your chances depending on how quickly the decision needs to be made, right? That makes sense. But there are some decisions that you make in your life that may require an incredible amount of percolation, and they might be the culmination of 10 years or 20 years of thinking about something or circumstance that are unrelated to a quick outcome, like when someone decides that they're now going to write their first novel, for instance. Carol Shields, who I had the esteemed privilege of being her student back when I was 19 years old. She is a Pulitzer Prize winning Canadian author, and I believe that her ability to understand human nature and bring her life experience to the fore helped her to write some incredible novels. But to decide that she was going to write her first novel was probably something, and I'm massively speculating here, but it was probably not a spontaneous decision, right? So I think what Leia's saying maybe, and I'm not speaking for you, Leia, but that the codification is something that allows you to put a lens on understanding decisions, but doesn't necessarily help you make a decision that's going to create the outcome that you're looking for.
I think it can do something in terms of like giving you alternative lenses to look at a particular problem with, and then trying to assess like what happens if I make a chaotic decision here versus making a calculated decision. Like that could be sort of an interesting take on it. For me personally, though, I think there's decisions that I want to make slowly and I want to take time with versus decisions that I want to make quickly. So I don't necessarily agree that quicker decisions are always better decisions. I think sometimes you need to take time to sort out what you're doing, particularly like the more complex the problem is, the worse off I think you are sometimes making that quick sort of decision, because you may not have all the information you need to do the thing that you need to do, or because you've made a quick decision, it could mean that you have not thought through some of the unintended consequences that could emerge later. And so, like, it's something that I think of, like, if I were to be doing work that was policy design oriented, like, there's a reason why decisions are made slowly in policy. It's because they have wide reaching repercussions, and you want to be careful in making some of those decisions there. And so, that longer time frame to sort of think things through, to do your research, to gather more information is important. Well, I actually want to go back a little bit to this idea of emergence, because there is an entire area of design now around emergent design, and how do you allow for things to sort of spontaneously emerge as opposed to doing the calculated thing. And I think it's like this idea of parameter setting that I like and find really interesting.
Cool. I'd love to hear more about that.
There's an interesting talk that I listened to from Bruce Sterling addressing, I forget what group it was, but it was like 1996 that he did this talk. I ended up downloading the MP3 off of YouTube and listening to it in my car a few times because I enjoyed it. But the emergent design that he was talking about was this artificial intelligence concept of AI design, where what you do is you give it the parameters, and the parameters are really simple. It's, in this case, it's the laws of physics are the parameters. The parameters are, here are the laws by which the universe is governed by that we've modeled inside of your artificially intelligent brain. And here's the thing that we want you to do. We want you to imagine a lawnmower, let's say. And then what it does is it knows what the task is, how to cut the grass and how this thing might work. And it just iterates and iterates and reiterates designs, millions of designs in a short amount of time. And after having not just iterated, but modeled and used it in a virtual environment that mimics physics exactly like we would experience here in the world, including things like rain and all that stuff, it was able to present an object, a machine that was going to mow your lawn, but was absolutely foreign and alien to us, because as a lawnmower, it did the job perfectly and autonomously and all that stuff, but as a human design, it didn't make sense to us, because we tend to apply the parameter of human understanding to the things that we invent, whereas a computer might not do that. So there's some really interesting ideas around emergent design in AI, and letting it surprise us with what it has determined to be the most, efficient, effective design that it could come up with.
My favorite thing that I've seen AI do is design blueprints for buildings, where they said, here's what we need. Design a school, and then here are some of the parameters that we need for a school. And then it would design some of the craziest looking things that you've seen. It looks very organic. It does not look like a grid of classrooms. It's very much trying to maximize sunlight, or trying to keep everybody close to a bathroom, or make sure that there's certain shared spaces. And it just throws out all, like you were talking about, all the presumptions that we already have around how a school should be designed, and just goes to first principles, which we talked about before, which are defined by the whoever's putting the input into this AI, right? It's like, what's important to a school? Well, it's important that kids can get from class to class, that they have access to, I don't know, the nursing station, whatever it is, and then suddenly all of the assumptions are thrown out, and the computer comes back with a way of thinking that the human mind, with its assumptions, can't come to.
There's parametric architecture, parametric design in architecture, which it's just that it's parameter based. The parameters are set by humans. Usually, it needs to be like this, it needs to be like that. But what happens is that when you define the outer edges and say, I need a building to be 40 feet wide by 200 feet tall, boom, the parameters know how to do this. And from what I understand, there is a version of AutoCAD, which is like a leading architecture software, that introduced parametric design. And from that version of AutoCAD, parametric designed buildings started to get designed and constructed. And from what I've heard, there are some buildings that you can just point at and you can tell which version of AutoCAD was used to design that building.
Damn, that's funny. The idea of making decisions. So I've been thinking a lot about, especially now in this COVID-19 era, I've been thinking a lot about privilege, and also that we make decisions and assumptions that are sometimes pretty arrogant, where we imagine that things are never going to change. So, before World War II, I'm speaking specifically around North America, but before World War II, you could be planning your life, and then all of a sudden this massive change happens. And this happened to my grandparents, where I believe that my grandfather thought that he would just be a typical math professor in this small town in Russia, and he would be getting married soon, and that his life would just continue on in this trajectory that making a bunch of assumptions, and then all of a sudden he's thrown into completely different circumstances, and the decisions that he had made his entire life become not completely irrelevant, but completely out of his control. The fact that we think that we can plan our lives out and that they're not going to be affected by climate change, by outbreaks and pandemics like this, or by wars, etc., is a sort of, if it's not arrogant, it's very presumptive and ignorant to decide that, to make decisions based on things never really changing for the worse. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, there's like there's a quote, if you want to make God laugh, make plans, or something like that. Like,
yeah, that's good.
Where there's making plans, or it's almost like there's going to be something that's going to derail it. Like, it's almost guaranteed.
Yeah,
but
it's like the universe's hobby is to knock those plans aside.
Right, to like create chaos. It's a world of entropy. It's going to break down. So yeah, I kind of agree with you there. And the disruption is going to happen. And I think we get very complacent. And I think there is something to be said about, like, we're quite comfortable and we have a fair bit of privilege, and that allows us to sort of get complacent in a lot of ways, of thinking that, things are going to continue as is. But there's a flip side to that as well, which is that when you are in a situation like poverty, when you're experiencing poverty, it hijacks your brain. And so you can't make long-term decisions the same way you could if you weren't under those conditions. So there's conditions that change our ability to think about the long term and to make better decisions as well. And so when those conditions are changed on us by external forces or by something going wrong, then our ability to make decisions changes within those circumstances too. So I think the fact that we're experiencing a massive disruption that, people didn't see coming, that we were kind of warned about repeatedly, that we should have seen coming and didn't prepare for, and the fact that there are bigger disruptions on the horizon that we're kind of pushing aside somewhat at this time, those are things that we all kind of have to watch out for, because our lives at some point are going to be interrupted again. Like, I keep looking at the issue around the financial markets, and what millennials are saying is like, we were told the last time the recession happened, it was a once in a lifetime recession, and here we are again with another big disruption,
Right.
another recession, and potentially going into a depression this time.
That probably happened between 1914 and whenever World War II started too. It's like, again, are you serious?
And there's always something. There's always something. So I don't know why we're constantly surprised by it.
Yeah.
There is the normalcy bias. When things are normal and comfortable, we just tend to think that things are just going to continue on as they currently are. Yeah, and I think that's where the normalcy bias kind of comes in. And, radical change is hard to accept. Think of all the people who couldn't even accept that this virus was a real thing, or was calling it overblown. Yeah, there's a lot of people that still can't accept it now, but hypodermic needles and Lysol to the rescue.
There's a really, really great article in the New York Times magazine right now by a chef, Gabriel Hamilton, who runs a restaurant that I've been to in New York called Prune, and it's an interesting article looking back on her career. So the title is "My Restaurant Was My Life for 20 Years. Does the World Need It Anymore?" And she's a great writer, and she's reflecting on the idea of whether or not her decisions and her dreams are still valid in today's universe, right? Today's environment. And it's a really interesting reflective take on what do we do when the world takes a turn that does not include our own vision of ourselves.
I think that's the question I'm grappling with right now. It's like, where does my sort of little role that I play fall into this broader scheme of things, and how do I continue embodying some sort of role, whatever that is, that helps instead of hinders, whatever is coming next. So like, I look at the climate change stuff. That's my big concern. I just wrapped up writing a chapter on that for a book, and it's daunting to look at that issue straight on and acknowledge what it means, especially in contrast to this crisis, because I know that that's like 1,000-fold worse. Just to even wrap your head around it is so difficult, because you could keep going on and on and on with the number of implications that there are. Like, I had a hard time stopping with the research and stopping with the facts and stopping with all of this stuff, because the cascading effects of that were so extreme. So that's kind of, I'm kind of trying to find my place in the future as a futurist, which I don't know how to make sense of.
Do you see a positive spin on what's happening now as we've referred to before, a dress rehearsal, that the fact that the entire world can change so quickly and react so swiftly when it decides to, not perfectly, obviously, but that maybe it can be spun in a positive light when you look at it in context of climate change? Maybe
that's it's like a very cautious maybe, right? Because we go back, that's where I think the telltale signs really are, is like, how quickly do people try to get back to the lives that they had versus accepting like, oh, this was just one crisis. we've got to set up for the next thing. So right now, the conversations around climate change are happening in full swing because like a lot of people have pointed to the air pollution dropping as a big sign. There's cities that are now trying to take action, like Amsterdam is thinking of implementing donut economics, which includes thinking about the environment. So there's a lot of changes that are happening. The question is, are we collectively going to come out of this, let's say, months from now and think, well, that was a nice little blip, let's get back to things? Or are we going to use the opportunity to make those changes? Or, are we going to shut down? Like, who knows collectively how we're going to react? As individuals, we're going to see the full spectrum of behaviors emerge, just as we do at any other time, where there's going to be people who say, okay, this was the example. This is the thing that should teach us how to behave going forward. And then you're going to have the people on the other end who are just like protesting during a crisis and blocking the pathways to hospitals. And, how are those people going to react? Are they going to care? Maybe, maybe not. So it just, the possibilities are kind of all on the table right now. It's a matter of watching to see where things go next. In an ideal world, we would have figured it out.
It's tough. You'd think that the glimmer of hope that I have coming out of this is that people start to really pay attention to the science and listen to the scientists and observe facts and have respect for that level of authority. And I would say that, a lot of the problems with the world are largely due to people who are, anti-science, anti-fact, nationalist mentality, protectionist mentality. These are the people that it's tough to reason with, but they're the ones that need to ultimately convert to a reasonable way of thinking and realize that it's not about you, it's about us. That we have to stop the debate of capitalism versus socialism versus communism, and we need to just start looking at us-ism. We need to see what is going to be the best for all of us globally. And right now, all signs point to science being the way to do that, because science is hard on itself and it's important to be wrong. It's more important to be wrong because the way that you are precise is by being precisely wrong. And I think that's the great thing about science, is that it works hard to undo its theories, and the ones that survive are the ones that are known to be true.
It sounds a lot like Star Trek.
Yeah.
I would love to see a Star Trek before the Federation. I've said that a few times in terms of how do we get to the utopia? What's the path to the utopia? I would want to see, how do you build? What are the challenges that you go through? What are the decisions that you make on the pathway there? Because I think that's one of those images in a society that's kind of missing. So I advocate for a thing called polytopias, which is showing the pathway to change and how a system moves from one state to another, as opposed to just the ends of the spectrum, which are the dystopia and the utopia. So I think we need to see that. And to build upon what you're saying, Trey, because I've been thinking about the same line of thinking there in terms of we need a return to respect for scientists. I think we need a return to respect for academia in general, because there's a lot of other perspectives that could have been helpful here. I think about the perspective of historians, for instance, who've watched crisis happen, and studied crisis over and over again, that would probably have something quite valuable to say in terms of how we move forward right now. Or sociologists who can, point to the broad spectrum of behaviors that we're seeing, and help us understand those better, and think about how do we then align ourselves to better behaviors overall and all of that stuff. So I think we need a return to respect for a lot of things that we've kind of lost, partly maybe due to mainstream media as well. I think back to, somebody once said something about Friends to me, the fact that the only academically oriented, scientifically oriented character on the show, Ross, was constantly derided as just in the American psyche now, because they just made fun of him and made fun of him at every single turn. And so now we've kind of subconsciously absorb that idea of, turning our nose up at the academics.
Have you read A Short History of Progress?
I have not.
It's a really good book that goes through collapsed civilizations and talks about how they led to their own ruin. They talk about Easter Island, for instance, how they worship these gods and they would plant these heads on the shore. And in order to plant the heads on the shore, they had to cut down the trees in order to build the scaffolding required to plant the heads. And then as the nature started to disappear because they were starting to run out of forestry, they ended up chopping down the trees because they needed to appease the gods even more. So they built more heads and they built more heads, and then they ran out of forest and they had filled the island with heads and then they ended up going extinct. I think the best futurists, in my opinion, are historians. Yuval Noah Harari is one of the brightest futurists, and he's a historian. He doesn't call himself a futurist.
Sapiens is that my number one go-to. That book had more information in it than pretty much anything that I've read in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Add one more thing that I think is interesting. So it's a model that I've been prescribing to people more and more now, and it comes out of the Stanford D School. So they came up with a way that they sort of help people think about their lives and plan their decisions. And one of the things that they do is they make you think of 3 alternatives, where you come up with 3 potential pathways for your life, and you think about how things could play out. The catch is that you're supposed to think of 3 good things. So 3 equally good things in terms of how your life could play out. And so it forces you to think about like how your life could go well in different ways. And I think that's something we kind of don't allow ourselves, is that ability to think about how things could be good, but in a completely different way from each other. And so that sort of cultivating of different ways of moving forward that you're okay with, or that you feel good about, can ease the sort of tension on the decisions that you make as well, because that if things go off one path, you can find yourself on another good path.
I like that. It's not binary. You're not deciding good or bad. You're deciding a bunch of things that lead to other things.
Yeah, like when I grow up, I'm going to have either a Ferrari, a Mercedes, or a Porsche.
Yeah, that's old school.
I do like that idea because what it does is it trains the idea of multiplicity of futures that are out there. I think a lot of people grow up with this idea that you grow up, you get a job, you get married, you have kids, you grow old, you retire. Like that's it. That's the trajectory that's been ingrained in society for a long, long time. That's a great positive future. So now imagine a similar future where one of those things is taken out of the equation, the marriage or the kids, let's say. Now imagine a positive future. Okay, well, you now have the ability to, let's say, travel and do stuff, or you can do this and so on. Even, there's some research that shows that serious contemplation about your death is good for your mental health. Like you tend to have a better outlook on life in general when you seriously consider these things. And a lot of people don't consider this. They ignore the idea that they're going to die or their loved ones are going to die. And I think just mentally preparing is a really, really important way to have a healthy outlook on things, at the risk of having a full-on breakdown and freaking out and not knowing how to handle it in a healthy way.
It's one of the ways of making better decisions as well. Like sometimes in terms of sorting out what you want your life to be and clarifying your own values for yourself, is to think about your obituary. So you transport yourself into the future and you think about what it is that you want other people to say about you, who it is that you want around you at that time. And you use that sort of thought experiment to clarify who you should be now and what you should be doing.
That was my first creative writing assignment with Carol Shields. She asked the class to write our own obituaries, and that was the first thing I had to do at I think 19 or 20. Write what would be written about me when I died, and that was really interesting thought experiment, especially at that age.
It's a really bold move to do as a professor in university. That's awesome.
So the strange thing about what you just said is that it relates directly back to the show that I was watching this week that was released on Netflix. It's called The Midnight Gospel. Have either of you heard about it or read about it? So it's crazy. It's basically, it's very hard to explain because it's a Spacecast. It's like a future podcast, basically. It is the culmination of two people. One is Pendleton Ward, who invented Adventure Time when he came out of university, which is a famous. It's a famous Cartoon Network TV show, but he's always had pretty high ambitions and a really crazy way of thinking about the universe, and you can tell from watching Adventure Time that there are a lot of metaphysical themes going on that run really, really deep. So he connected with a podcaster named Duncan Trussell, who has his own show and has been interviewing all sorts of interesting people that talking about meditation. He interviewed his own mom who was dying. He's a very interesting person, but capable of bringing people's insights to the fore. And what they did was combine to create an animated series that animates the podcasts with crazy stuff happening in the background. It's about one guy who wants to do this Spacecast and find interesting people on multiple universes to talk to about different things. And they literally decided that every piece of animation was going to be relevant. They weren't going to do just a bunch of weird random stuff. Some of it is very violent. Some of it is very crazy, disturbing, but yet all this madness that's happening in the animation is it. So to me, it's like Adventure Time meets My Dinner with Andre, which is like a 2-hour conversation. But this is a almost a psychedelic manifestation of the conversations, and almost like it's bringing the subconscious to light. So I feel like it, in a way, it relates to decisions because everything that they put in front of the viewer is deliberate, and it's thought through, and it still feels like it is improv, spontaneous, and insane, like you have just dropped acid and are watching what's happening in a banal conversation, or actually it's an interesting conversation, but what's happening around that feels like it's imbued with this sense of the absurd, and it's absolutely profound and vulgar and the best possible panacea to what's happening in the world right now. I honestly watched it and couldn't even believe that it existed.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to checking this out. I love Adventure Time. I think that's such a great show. You introduced me to Adventure Time.
I was obsessed with that show because it was infinitely creative, and that the things that happened had consequences that reverberated through the show. And it's supposed to be a show for little kids, right? And it's interesting that we grew up in a time, I think, when animation was just at the forefront, but TV shows were about churning out a formula, especially animated shows. there was a formula, you churn it out every week, and there were no consequences. It was always just, here's the next story, and the stories don't necessarily connect. There's no arc. But I feel like in the last 20 years, there's been a pretty big shift that people want a story to continue, and they want to understand the consequences, which maybe is related to the situations that we're in. Maybe it's a distraction, or maybe it will be our savior. I don't know.
We're all sort of gathering our thoughts. Their decisions have consequences, but maybe only in hindsight.
Yeah, that's heavy. It's also exciting because something's going to happen next, and we're gonna hopefully live through it and be able to reflect on it or pass that on to another generation. And maybe just to wrap up the idea or the thoughts that I had about my grandparents, they went through an insane time. And I mean, just to give you a tiny bit of context, my uncle, who was born on the same day as me and who passed away in last year, he was born at sea because my grandparents were fleeing Europe and the chaos that was happening, and ended up moving to South America and living in a tiny little group of people that were trying to farm in the jungle, which didn't even make sense, and ended up finally making their way to Winnipeg, Manitoba, and living in the frozen prairies from the jungle. And then my grandfather, who had been a professor of mathematics, was assembling furniture in a factory just so that his family could live and get by. And they had a house that didn't have plumbing, which seems insane. And they had an outhouse in the backyard. And all of that sounds like crazy talk now. Like although now that we're in this COVID thing, it's like, guess what? Society has its limitations, and when the shit hits the fan, certain things stop working, and when they stop working, things can get really, really different really, really fast. And the fact that they survived, the fact that they thrived, the fact that they focused on family, it's just, to me, a really strong incentive and motivation to see this through and to help build something better.
I think we all have when we start to dig into things, we probably all have these weird, crazy moments of like, and that's why you're here today, because this one crazy thing was done. Like, I'm here because I had a doctor when I was about maybe, I think, 2 years old, make the decision to do an x-ray on me because I had swallowed or inhaled a peanut and was slowly suffocating to death, and nobody knew what was going on. And you're not supposed to do x-rays on babies, right? So it's like somebody making a decision somewhere impacts your life and can completely send you on a completely different trajectory than the one that you were on. And it's insane to sort of think about. And it goes into this idea, because we didn't even get into this idea of like how other people's decisions impact us.
Yeah, you're either the driver or the passenger in the car, right? Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you're not listening to the podcast right now, that sucks, because there's tons of good information in it, and you should go read the show notes, because there's really good links in the show notes to keep you busy and occupied for a long, long time. From all of us at the Post Normal Show, we'll see you in the future.